So you have this seminar going on what is it, death, karma and wisdom, and in the Samagavasa community I was having my meal with the community this evening, and somebody said that Maitreya Bandhu's talk last week was the very best talk he'd ever heard. And they said it in such a way as to make me feel incredibly intimidated. Fortunately, this isn't a competition, so I'm not going to even try to best Maitreya Bandhu. That wouldn't be possible. And Maitreya Bandhu did phone me up in the week and gave me a very long brief on what I should be doing this evening, and I said, well, I won't do that, but I will talk about I think I will talk about the Buddhist view of death or something. Yeah, something like that. Well, I'm not sure I'm going to do that. What I am going to talk about is the Buddha. I'm going to talk about the Buddha, and that's where we're going to start. And it was very good to hear Sila Pia talk about the lead up to the celebration of the Buddha's enlightenment. So it's very important, I think, that if we are talking about the subject of death and karma and wisdom, that we go back to the very origins of Buddhist tradition and the Buddha himself. And what came to my mind as soon as Maitreya Bandhu spoke to me on the phone was a very particular moment, one of the most poignant moments probably in all of Buddhist literature, Buddhist canonical literature, and it's not at the time of the Buddha's enlightenment, it's at the time of the Buddha's death. Although tradition says that the Buddha didn't die, that's not an appropriate term, because the Buddha's, we speak of it as death, but for an enlightened being it's what's called parinirvana, the full and perfect final nirvana, which is a complete mystery. The Buddha wouldn't say anything about the nature of what happens to the liberated one on the dissolution of the physical body. And it's very, very important that we preserve that mystery. You can't say that he is not both or neither. You really are up against the mystery of enlightenment. But of course the Buddha also said that that's true also while he's alive. You can't say he is not both or neither. So this is a very, very important sense, when we see the Buddha image, when we hear descriptions of the Buddha's enlightenment, and in the West we have so much facility with concepts and ideas and so on and so forth, and we can think we know what it is. We've always got to have that sense of actually we're coming up to the edge of the precipice, if you like. But the Buddha's last days are really quite extraordinary, quite wonderful. He was very old, he was probably in his 80s. He gained enlightenment probably in his late 30s, maybe younger. Different traditions say different things. And after his attainment of enlightenment, which of course is the absolute fullness of wisdom, seeing things as they really are, which can never be dimmed, and the absolute fullness of love and compassion, solidarity with all life, the Buddha spent, after his enlightenment, his days wandering. He was a bhikkhu, a shramana, that is a wanderer who just wore his rag robes and begged his one meal a day, and he spent his time, except in the rainy season when he stayed in retreat, just wandering from place to place, communicating with people, communicating his, what he'd discovered, really getting into rapport with whoever he met. He could talk to anybody, kings, queens, housewives, merchants, other wanderers, young people, old people, didn't matter who was before him. Sometimes it would be a great discourse at some great gathering. Sometimes it would be a more spontaneous interaction. But that's what he did. That's what he spent his time doing, just giving, naturally, giving. This is very important when you talk about, enlightenment, and it's very fashionable for people to make claims about enlightenment and insight and all that nonsense. But the manifestation is giving. The manifestation of any kind of realization is generosity, natural generosity, giving to people in an appropriate way. That's what he did. That's how the Buddha lived. And he carried on doing that right up until he was an old man, a very, very sick man, just wandering from place to place, communicating. But the time came when, the body really started to, completely run out. There's very, very poignant moments in this last tour. His always with him was his, what's known as his attendant, but really it was his close friend, Ananda, the wonderful Ananda, the very faithful Ananda. There's a wonderful moment where they have their daily bath, probably in what they call in India a tank of water, and they're afterwards they've dried off, and Ananda used to massage the Buddha. A very, very common thing that you might see in India. He used to massage him, and Ananda commented, I remember Bhagwan, I remember Lord, when your body was, your skin glowed with youth, and now it's old. And the Buddha chuckled, and he just laughed and made some sort of ironic comment about that beautiful, tender moment. You don't often think of the Buddha in this way and his disciples in this way. Usually the Buddha can appear as a sort of almost like a superhero figure, but no, there's this very, very human quality. Old men, if you like, were here kind of caring for one another, and the Buddha used it as a way of communicating to Ananda. Well, this is what happens. You grow old. This even a Buddha grows old. Anyway, they go to this very obscure place in northern India, Kushinagara. It wasn't one of the main centres, and it's still a mystery to this day. Why did the Buddha go to this wattle and daub village to have this incredible moment of entering parinirvana? Why didn't he go to one of the great centres of Buddhism? Probably he wanted to just carry on what he was doing, and that was to go and take the message of the Dharma to a new place, the message of Buddhism to a new place. Even though he was very, very sick, he had dysentery, he had terrible backache. He said the only time he knew no pain was when he was absorbed in very, very deep meditation, when the mind is completely taken away from the senses. And there's a lovely moment where he says to Ananda, I'm like an old cart now, an old cart. I can only keep, that can only keep going because it's strapped up with ropes. It's like he's saying, I'm just holding it together. I'm just holding it together to communicate the Dharma, and especially to go and see, his own disciples and his own community, and to make sure that they had everything they, needed before he, entered parinirvana, before he left this world. And so they gather in this village of Kushinagara. It's in modern-day Uttar Pradesh in northern India. And it's an amazing scene that's described. He finds a stone couch, a stone platform actually, that was a sort of gathering place for the local tribe, the Mullahs as they were called. And he lay down on this stone couch, and between two sala trees that miraculously burst into pink blossoms that fell down on his body. And there's a kind of great gathering. Lots of people were just coming to see this great event, this great last teaching of the Buddha. The last teaching is him passing away, passing out of this life. He's still teaching, he's still communicating. And Ananda had been the organiser of all this. That's what Ananda did as the Buddha's attendant and as his close friend. He was the sort of, at times, the interface between, if you like, the Buddha and everybody else. And of course, at this point, he realises what is happening. They've been on this tour. He's had to give all his attention to the Buddha and everybody else. And he suddenly realised, this is it. He's going. And he just went away. We find him drifting away from the gathering and just leaning against the doorway of one of these huts, and he's sobbing. And he says, the master, my teacher, is about to pass away, and I am still a learner. I'm still at a very elementary stage of development. Actually, Ananda was very highly developed, but in relation to the Buddha, he wasn't at that level. My master is about to pass away. He who is so kind. He who is so kind. Our teacher, Sangharakshita, says all of Buddhism is in that phrase. All of Buddhism is in that phrase. He who is so kind. Not the wise Buddha refuting, all of the arguments of other traditions. Not the energetic Buddha. Not the meditating Buddha. The kind Buddha. That's what he remembered of the Buddha. And Ananda had seen him. He'd been his attendant for more than 20 years. He'd seen him in all sorts of situations, all sorts of events. Kindness. Continual, consistent kindness. And the Buddha notices, even in this great throng with all of his other great disciples and all these people coming to pay respects, and he notices that Ananda's not there. And he asks another monk, well, where's Ananda? And they explain, he's weeping, he can't, he's broken up by what's happening. So the Buddha said, well, bring him to me. And the Buddha you're never told how they speak in the Pali Canon. And when you first read it, especially in old translations, you can almost hear this done by sort of, Protestant colonialists. They can sound very, very stern. But I don't think the Buddha would have spoken sternly. He said to Ananda, have I not told you that everything that is born, that everything that is constructed, that everything that can come together, have I not told you that it will transform, it will change, it will break up, it will pass away? It's impossible for this to be any other way. Everything that arises, everything that is born must die. Everything that begins must end. It cannot be any other way. And I imagine him saying it with enormous tenderness. He doesn't rebuke Ananda. He gives him a really compassionate and kind teaching. It's the truth. It's reality. Look, this is happening. This is the way it is. But it's delivered with great kindness and compassion and tenderness. Don't we know it sometimes when things get a bit real? If only it could have been delivered with a bit more tenderness and kindness. Wouldn't it be better? But then he says a very interesting thing. He said, you've done well, Ananda. You will find the way to enlightenment. It will happen. And then he goes into this big rejoicing about Ananda. First of all, he says how kind Ananda has been to him. In body, speech and mind. Through physical action, verbal action, through mental action, in private, in public, unstintingly giving ease through his love. Not only that, he said, people love Ananda. Everybody loves Ananda when he teaches the Dhamma. Everybody gathers. They want to hear him speak. They want to hear him communicate the Dhamma. They're very disappointed when he stops. And in India, my experience of living in India, unless you speak for at least 2 hours, it's regarded as a very short talk. It's absolutely exhausting teaching the Dhamma in India. It's got to be a really big event. Well, it used to be back in the day before mobile phones and all that sort of thing. Don't worry, I won't go on for 2 hours. But really rejoicing in talking about his wisdom and so on. So, look, the reason why I start with this story is that it's about a man, in our terms, dying. It's about his friend grieving over that. And what do they remember about each other? They remember kindness, consistent loving kindness to one another. That's an incredible thing to remember. What a wonderful thing to remember, that at the point of death, both of them, remember their kindness to one another. That there is this, and in the case of the Buddha, this compassion for his disciple and this encouragement of his disciple and this rejoicing in the disciple. Very unusual for a teacher to rejoice in a disciple, but there it is in this very, very poignant moment, the point of the Buddha's entry into parinirvana. Various other things happen to that, but there's this one last great teaching of the Buddha before he enters into the path of profound meditation that leads to this mysterious state of parinirvana. He says, as he's lying there on his side in what they call the lion posture, on this stone couch, he says to everybody, look, all conditioned things are impermanent. All put together things are impermanent. They don't last forever. Everything that arises passes away. With mindfulness, strive on. The last words of the Buddha. With mindfulness, strive on. So three things. All conditioned things are impermanent. Look at that. Really look at that. Take that right in. And in relation to that, with mindfulness, strive on. The words in Pali are appamadena sampadeta. Appamadena sampadeta. And the tradition continues, because in our ordination ceremonies, after you give people at the time of ordination what are called the refuges and the precepts, you exhort them with these very words. You say, having well observed the 3 refuges and the 10 ordination vows, with mindfulness, strive on. And that's all you need to know. With mindfulness, strive on. So 3 things the Buddha is saying you need to know. You need to know that everything is impermanent. Everything changes. And in relation to that, you need appamada, which we're loosely translating as mindfulness, and you need striving and effort. I say appamada is loosely translated as mindfulness. We're not talking about, when we talk about mindfulness here, we're not talking about how to suck a raisin. These things? People say, suck a raisin and see what it tastes like. It's really concentrate. That's mindfulness. No, that's not what the Buddha teaches. I don't think he ever said anything about sucking raisins in the Pali Canon. We're not talking about mindfulness as sort of adjustment therapy for daily life. I'm not knocking that. If you're benefiting from that kind of mindfulness, great. But it's not the whole story about mindfulness in Buddhist tradition. Very important not to get confused. Appamada is more literally translated as non-intoxication. Pamada means intoxication, both in the literal sense of being drunk or tripped out or something like that, stoned. But it can also mean in the ordinary sense that you're not fully present to reality. You're off in your fairyland and intoxicated with what's going on with life, and you're not paying attention to your actual situation, to your existential situation. You're not paying attention to the fact that everything is changing, that everything is impermanent, that everything arises and passes away. So appamada is a kind of very, very alert sobriety. Alertness would be another very good translation. Aliveness and alertness. You're alert to what you need to do in relation to what's actually happening. You're aware of it, you're taking it in, but you want to do something about it. Appamada really, the trouble is with some presentations of mindfulness, it can make you sound as though you need to be passive to experience. Appamada is the complete opposite of that. There's no passivity, there's receptivity to experience, to what's happening, but you're looking to develop, to respond to the significance of your circumstances. Okay, everything is impermanent. Everything is change. What am I going to do in relation to that? How should I live in relation to that? So let's try and go into that a little bit more in relation to this business of death, karma and wisdom, and relate it to appramada. I mean, another way you could talk about appramada is waking up. You're just waking up to what's happening. So let's talk a little bit about death, and let's look a bit at the classical traditions of death meditation in Buddhism. These can be quite heavy meditations. We're not going to sit and do these meditations because, sometimes it happens even in Buddhist tradition. It's happened where death meditation has been taught inappropriately or practiced inappropriately. It's led to depression. It's led to despair. It's led to nihilism. So we've got to be very, very careful with how we approach this. But at the same time, we have got to wake up. We've got to have this appramada, this alertness, this vigilance. It's another translation of appramada, vigilance. So the fact that, first of all, let's get it very, very clear in our mind that we will die. We will actually die. Let's not just an idea, but actually taking that right into the heart, into the mind. We will die. You're not going to cheat it. That's not going to happen. I mean, they love the Buddhist tradition loves kind of really dwelling on that meditation. That just look around. It doesn't matter who they are. Great kings. In these day and age, great celebrities, great heroes, even the Buddha, the incredible Buddha with all his psychic powers going on, even his own body passed away. There's no way round it, people. Your life will end. That is what's going to happen. So that's, fairly good. It's fairly clear, and I'm sure nobody would dispute that, the fact that we will actually die, although, we don't often meditate on it. There's some lovely verses in Buddhist tradition. I say lovely, I mean they're very impressive. Night and day, my body advances to destruction. Nothing can stop it. I must surely die. This is the great 8th century Indian master Shantideva. Night and day, my body advances to destruction. Nothing can stop it. Yeah, keep it in good condition, for sure. Don't need to, you do need to be in good health. Don't take that as a sort of, oh well, it's going to happen, so let's not look after it. No, because another thing that goes with this is waking up to the preciousness of our experience. But let's be clear, it's not if, it's when. It's definitely when, that's right, isn't it? The second meditation that they give is you actually don't know when you'll die. The moment of death is uncertain and completely unpredictable. Again, the masters like to quote the Buddha. Even Buddhas can't predict when someone will die. It's a very, very uncertain moment. There's all sorts of conditions and things that can happen that can bring about the moment of death. Third reflection that goes with that: at the time of death, the only thing of any value is the Dharma. This is the Buddhist tradition speaking. At the time of death, what you really need is a training that can actually relate to what is actually happening. Don't assume either it's going to be a nice long drawn out process where you're on your deathbed and people are singing Buddhist hymns to you and giving you really good Buddhist advice as you go off into that wonderful land and have a nice groovy rebirth somewhere. Might not be like that. Might be very, very sudden that it happens. Buddhist training is to prepare you for this. Is to prepare you for this moment. All of the meditations, the mindfulness of breathing, the Padmavajra, the devotional practice, the ethical practice, the practice of spiritual friendship, all these different things are to prepare you for this moment of death, which could come at any time. So we're being asked to then value this very, very precious human opportunity. This is what comes out of it. The valuing of this very, very precious human moment. The word in Sanskrit is kshana, which is often applied to the human life itself. But kshana can also mean the moment. This moment. This very time. The great Zen master Dogen has a wonderful discourse on impermanence, which he is saying, waking up to impermanence, waking up to death, will give you the motivation for serious practice. You know, if you really want to get down to serious practice, if you really meditate on the transience of life, if you really meditate on that, you will be very, very motivated to practice very, very seriously. And he says, you are only alive right now. You are only alive right now. And there's something really important in this reflection. Really important in this reflection. It's so easy, I do it myself, to have this sort of fantasy human life, fantasy Buddhist life, or fantasy creative life. Oh, when this is sorted out, I'll do this. I will do that art course. I will write that poem. I will do that meditation. I will go on that retreat. I will be that good person. I will say those good words to that person that I should have said a long time ago. But how long can we delay? You're only alive right now. You're not alive in some fantasy land in the future. That's not there. That doesn't exist. It's a complete luxury and avoidance of the very, very fact that we're in the moment now. A moment that is always passing, that is always moving, that is always arriving and ceasing, and could actually be our last moment. Could actually be our very last moment. So what I find when I meditate on this particular meditation is that suddenly I come into a very, very full awareness. A very, very full awareness. A very full sense of being present. Really present to what is happening in my experience. And yes, there is something absolutely wonderful about that, really vivid about that. Really very, very vivid. You know, it was lovely hearing Sila Pia talk today about going into the park, and I was in the park this afternoon, and I wasn't sitting, I was with a friend, and we were smelling blossoms. These, honestly, they are incredible blossoms. Paramabandhu told me what he thought the name of them were, but if you go into the park, Victoria Park, I've got to tell you this, there are these wonderful trees, and they've got these, they look a bit like sort of a cascade of, almost like lupins, and they're a kind of creamy colour. The scent is just so amazing. I mean, it is just so transporting. You smell those flowers, you're not in Bethnal Green anymore, you're in some incredible heaven. And the friend I was with told me, she said, look, you do realise that apparently there's something in our nose, I didn't quite understand it, that means that we can't smell it after a certain period. You don't smell it anymore. So that's so interesting. So it's just a moment of scent. A moment of scent. You can't hold on to it, you can't cling to it. It arises, it goes, it's very vivid, it's incredibly impermanent. Just in that moment, you are only alive right now. But you know, there's another thing, that's not quite enough when it comes to meditating on the uncertain moment of the time of death, if it was just that, we'd end up just with a kind of, hedonism. And it can sometimes be like that, can't it? When people, realise that they're going to die. I've had friends like this who, have a very serious illness, and, they were talking about, this is it. I'm really going to go for enlightenment now. This is the moment. Of course, they get better, and it doesn't quite work like that. Suddenly, they're doing something else. It's like suddenly they're off on this stratospheric career. Well, great, if that's what you really want to do. But that isn't quite what is intended by Buddhist tradition. But, if that's what you want to do, fine. But this awareness of death clarifies things for people. Really clarifies what you really want to do. It's not just death. Getting older does that, doesn't it? The famous midlife crisis, which seems to be getting older. I think it's more like delayed adolescence these days. It's not midlife crisis. Adolescence seems to last forever, doesn't it? People, doing all sorts of weird stuff. But the Buddhist tradition is more it's more sober than that. If you're really seeing the nature of death and impermanence, what will happen? What will you do in response to that? How will you act? How will you behave? There's a lot of things one could say about this, about what you would do, and we could go on and on and on about it. You could even have workshops on it. I think, aren't there those things like, I don't know, what do you want on your gravestone or whatever, all that sort of thing. But there's something I heard a long time ago when I lived in India, when I was in my early 20s. It was after I worked here. I went out to India, not on the hippie trail, I may add. I went to help an order member named Lokamitra, a very, very dynamic order member, start our Buddhist activities in India with the Dalit community, with Buddhists in India. There was a big conversion movement to Buddhism in the late 1950s, early 1960s, which our teacher, Sangharakshita, was very involved in. And eventually we went back to work with that community. Well, we were invited to work with that community, and that work continues very, very powerfully. But when we started, it was a very small group of friends. There was Lokamitra and myself and a community of Indian, eventually order members and so on. It was a lovely, very close-knit Sangha of friends and mitras at first, and we didn't have a big centre. We were just doing stuff wherever we could. And one day, as can often happen in India, one of our close friends just died. Family man with children. We don't know how he died, just some fever or something like that. One day he was there, the next day he died. It was a very, very big thing for our little community, and we had the traditional Buddhist cremation ceremony. It was the first time I'd seen a dead body as he lay on this open pyre of wood and cow dung, and actually watching the body go up in flames, and it was an extraordinary event of very, very moving, very sad in many ways for us, his close friends, and of course, catastrophic for his wife and children. But there was also this wonderful openness about what was happening. No being hidden away in a coffin. Everything open at the burning ghat down by the river. Everything open. Lovely orations by the people leading the ceremony. Very, very clear and clean and sober. Strangely sort of exhilarating and moving and sobering. And some months later, Sangharakshita, our teacher, came out to do some lectures, and he did a talk, what we call in India Punyanamodana ceremony. This happens a few months after somebody's died, and it's a traditional ceremony of rejoicing in the merits of the person who's died, there's food, there's a meal given to the honoured guests and so on, and a very, very positive event. And Sangharakshita's talk was a very important talk for me, because he told me something, or told us something, where I knew the Buddha was enlightened. I knew the Buddha must have been enlightened, because Sangharakshita's talk was on a verse from the Dhammapada, verse 6, I think, which is quite hard to translate, which can be translated as something like, I'll say the verse before it, because that perhaps gives some sense of it. I might even talk about the verses before that. I'll read you the first 6 verses. I'll read you the first verses of the Dhammapada. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. Those who entertain such thoughts as, they abused me, they beat me, they conquered me, they robbed me, will not still their hatred. Those who do not entertain such thoughts as, they abused me, they beat me, they conquered me, they robbed me, will still their hatred. For in this world, not by hatreds are hatreds ever pacified. They are only pacified by love. This is the eternal law. Others do not realize, do not know that we are all heading for death. Those who do realize it will compose their quarrels. So Sangharakshita's talk was on this 6th verse. Others, that's people who are not awake to the reality of life and death. Others do not realize that we're all heading for death. Those who do realize it will compose their quarrels. I just thought that was breathtaking. I thought that was incredible. I thought, I'd never heard that, but I must have read that verse. I knew I'd read a lot of Buddhism, but it really hadn't gone in. To put together the realization that I'm going to die, you're going to die, that knowledge with ending quarrelling, ending disharmony, which means, of course, if you want to end quarrelling and disharmony, you better practice love, or at least not hating. You better practice love. You better be really careful in your interaction with people to put that together with the realization that you're going to die. I just think that is wisdom. That is knowing. It's so simple. It's so elegant. It's so true. There's no metaphysics here. There's no, in a sense, philosophy here. There's nothing complicated that you have to think about. All you have to think about, all you have to know is, the fact, well, if someone dies who you've fallen out with, what are you going to do about it? Okay, you can have loads of therapy and all that sort of thing and resolve it, for sure, and you can do that. You can resolve it on a deep internal level, but not with them, not with that person. And sometimes you can feel that, can't you, that somebody's died or moved away or something has happened in the interaction with people that you can't heal, that you can't mend, and you just feel horrible regret. Really horrible regret. It's a horrible feeling, that regret. I could have been better. I could have done something here about this situation. It didn't need to end like that. It didn't need to be like that. So the realization of actually we're going to die, actually we can die at any moment, should lead to this very, very strong awareness of the need to love. Not just love, but love well, love cleanly. I mean, this word love is so problematic. It covers so many things in our language. Buddhism is far more sophisticated with its the way it talks about what we would translate as love. So you get raga, which is intense sexual passion. Well, be a bit careful with that. If that's your loving. You've got sneha, very sound of it. Sineha in Pali, sticky affection. That affection you have where you just really sort of cling to somebody. Well, you don't notice you're doing it. Usually somebody's doing it to you and you don't want it. But you do it too. It's not just them. Sticky affection. Prema, which is Prema's an interesting one because it's a bit like being in love. You're convinced. I don't know if you're like me, but when you're in love with somebody, you're infatuated with them, you think it's incredibly selfless. You just exist for them. You just care about them. Of course, when it's not reciprocated or it ends, or it certainly turns into its opposite, doesn't it? Ill will and all the rest of it. Nico's nodding, thank you very much. All these things are not loving well. And also the thing about permanent, all these things are very exclusive. They're just locked on to one person, or maybe a kind of group of people, something like that. Not saying, you shouldn't do those things and all that. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to sound moralistic. But loving well. I mean, we have our loving responses to people, to people in family, friendship, lovers, loved ones of all kinds. But make sure that loving is as pure as can be. This is what we're doing in the Metabhavna. You have this Who Hates the Metabhavna seminar here. How can anybody hate the Metabhavna? I find that really bizarre. I love the Metabhavna. I want to do a day retreat here on loving the Metabhavna. I think it's an incredible practice because what you're doing, you're taking your whatever loving response you have for somebody and you're educating it. You're purifying it and you're expanding it to include more and more people. And yes, you are even going to include people that who you're indifferent to, and yes, people who you hate and who hate you. You're going to turn that around. You're going to change that, and it is the practice, I think, in relation to this teaching about death. This particular teaching of others do not realise that we're all heading for death. Those who do realise it will compose their quarrels. So if you're really serious about, waking up to the fact of, that we are going to die at any moment, really embrace this loving practice of Metabhavna. Purify and extend loving kindness and make sure that your relationships and connections with people are much more on the basis of this very, very strong friendly love. That it's a very interesting thing as well with Metabhavna and this realisation of death. And I know I've got to wind up soon. I've got to get a lot in quickly. The thing is, another thing about when you wake up to the fact that you could die at any moment is you realise how profoundly alone you are. Really, really profoundly alone. Kusala Sara was talking about being on solitary retreat. Solitary retreat is fantastic practice. I really don't like them. The last one I did was all right. But because you really are so alone. And, that's our situation. When you go out, there's nobody with you. I mean, there might be people around your bedside. But when you go on that journey, it's just you. You're a light unto yourself, an island unto yourself, as the Buddha says. You need to make the provisions, your own provisions for that journey, for that road, you're profoundly alone. And yet, when you do the Metabhavana, in that very aloneness, you have love for others. And when you have spiritual, what we call Sangha or spiritual community, that's a community where people realize their profound aloneness and they love each other very, very keenly, very, very well. And what you have then is not any kind of attached love. You have a deeply faithful love that's non-exclusive, non-particular, and which transcends time and space. I had an amazing experience recently. A very, very dear friend of mine, many years ago, left our order. I knew him when I was a kid, when I was 17. We came along to the Sangha together in Brighton. We got ordained in the same year. He worked here on this place. I met him in India. We spent a lot of time in India together. We were very, very close friends. And for one reason or another, he kind of went right out of our order, went on a wide, wide orbit. A couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, through a really weird set of coincidences, I never forgot him. Never forgot him. Always had him in my mind. Loved him. My friends loved him. You know, our mutual friends. We'd talk about him. Through a very weird set of coincidences, we met again. And I even reordained him, received him into the order a few years ago. When we met at Norwich railway station, he was living up in the northeast, it was like we'd only parted yesterday. I mean, he was a lot older, I was a lot older. It was a most peculiar experience. Actually, it wasn't. It was really ordinary. It was as if we'd not been parted. And he'd kept up practicing Buddhism. I'd kept up practicing Buddhism. It wasn't a kind of attached, sticky thing. It was very, very clean, but this deep, deep faithfulness. And what was also very, very lovely was my friends in the community, they said, well, we feel we already know him because you've talked so warmly about him. You know, we already know this man. He's kind of one of us. It wasn't having to sort of start again. Very strange thing, and yet very deeply alone, in the sense of individually practicing the Dharma alone. And that's, you know, in relation to this point about karma, of course, is that karmic action is you acting individually to develop along the path, and to develop, in this case, in loving kindness for one another. Of course, just to begin to wind up, of course, talking about quarrelling, I wonder if some of you had some questions in your mind. Well, suppose I'm being treated really badly, or there's a really unjust situation. Is not, how can metabhavna, how can loving kindness, how can this loving kindness face up to that? Because we know there's a lot of injustice in the world. And we know that you know, people can be very badly treated by other people. Never really happened to me, I have to say, thankfully. But you know, it does happen. You know, I hear you know, bad stories of people coming to the Sangha. What then? And I remember again in India, one of the moments of, you know, when things got very real for me was going to our regular meditation class, and it was Metabhavna that night, and there'd been a gathering of Buddhists. It was a big Buddhist day, and the police had done a truncheon charge with their bamboo canes on this peaceful Buddhist gathering, and people had been killed and hospitalised, and people came into that class very, very demoralised. And I remember one woman saying to me, how can your metabhavna be in relation to this? How can it be in relation to this? What does your metabhavna have to say to this? What does it do to this? You know, I was in my early 20s, you know, I'd been teaching the Dharma in, you know, West London and Bethnal Green. I thought, hang on, this has just got real. You know, this stuff has just got real. And I had to, in all humility, I didn't know what to say. I really didn't know what to say. It was a real wake up to, you know, how is metabhavna? How does it have the strength to stand up to that kind of oppression and that kind of violence? What's very, very interesting, though, about the Buddhist community, in India and our own Sangha, is how powerfully they've embraced loving kindness as a practice and non-violence as a practice in relation to these kinds of situations. I remember one order member in a talk, I was watching him give this talk, in answer to this question, he was saying, I think it was in Hindi, see if I can remember it now, Maitri, metta, mazbut ahe. It's strong, it's powerful. So when we talk about loving kindness, we're not talking about being passive. We're not talking about rolling over. We're talking about dealing with situations with enormous dignity and respect, self-respect and dignity, as much as respect for the other person. In the Padmavajra, you have the first stage, which is waking up to your own precious, dignified human existence. You don't have to get angry about that. You don't have to get hateful about that, but you can stand strongly in metta in relation to oppression, in relation to disharmony. You can speak the truth to what is going on without losing your sense of metta. So, this verse, before the stuff about another one of my favourite verses, I tend to think with these first 6 verses, if I really knew these, and I don't really know them, if I really knew these really deeply, in my blood and bones, that's where it's got to be. If I really knew these, I would for sure be enlightened. Or if not enlightened, I'd be very, very happy with what I knew. It's still work in progress. But for me, this is reality. This is the way things are. And I say, forget about all the kind of metaphysics of Buddhism, emptiness, not self. That's all rubbish. This is the real thing. This is the real thing. There was a big gathering in Cambodia after the end of the Khmer Rouge, and a great Cambodian monk, a great bhikkhu named Mahagosananda, this huge gathering of people who'd lost everything, lost families in terrible circumstances. He got up on the stage and he just started chanting in Pali over and over again. Not by hatred are hatreds ever pacified. Here in this world, they are pacified by love. This is the eternal law. This is the Sanatana Dhamma. This is reality. And an eyewitness said, nobody there. You could forgive anybody there for having hatred. You could forgive all of those people. This is what he chanted. And everybody joined in. Everybody joined in. So that's the message. It's a very simple message in relation to death. The only thing worth doing in relation to the reality of death is to love. Love really strongly, really well, really purely, whoever you meet, whoever you're with. Just respond with that openness and kindness. It's difficult. I can't do it. I'm enthusiastic about it. I can't do it. But I'm talking about it because it's the only thing I think is worth doing. It's the only sure thing to do. Everything else, it's all fairyland, everything else. This is the thing worth doing. That's it.